The fluorescent lights hum their mechanical song, the same song they've hummed for 20 years, and Margaret Walsh doesn't notice anymore. She arrives at Oak Creek Memorial in Houston at 10:56 p.m., badge clipped to her scrub pocket, hair pulled tight in a braid that she's worn the same way since 2004. The pediatric ICU night shift wraps around her like a familiar coat, quiet, controlled, anonymous. No photographs taped to her locker. No wedding ring catching the light. No personal items visible beyond the ceramic mug with a hairline crack splitting the words "World's Best," positioned on the shelf behind her spare scrubs at exactly 6.53 inches from the left edge. She exchanges minimal pleasantries with the departing day shift nurse, a younger woman named Jessica who talks about her daughter's soccer tournament while Margaret nods and updates the patient logs. Jessica doesn't ask about Margaret's weekend, and Margaret doesn't volunteer one. This is how it's been for 2 decades, presence without context, efficiency without intimacy. The night shift suits her. Fewer questions. Fewer eyes. The kind of work that asks only that you show up and do the job right, which Margaret has done every single night without fail, without complaint, without drawing attention to herself or the woman she used to be. Locker 247 is hers. Inside, spare scrubs, compression socks, a small bottle of ibuprofen, and tucked in the very back, behind everything else, a pair of combat boots with cracked leather and frayed laces stained with things that don't wash out. The soles are thin enough to feel the ground beneath them, Kandahar dust, Baghdad sand, 18 years of forward operating bases compressed into rubber and memory. She doesn't open that locker during the day. Only at night, when no one is watching, when she can reach back and let her fingers brush the leather for exactly 3 seconds before closing the door again. The ICU is 3/4 full at this hour. 8 children sleeping under monitor lights, their small chests rising and falling in mechanical rhythm. Margaret moves through the bay with the kind of grace that comes from muscle memory and purpose, checking vitals, adjusting foot drips, noting observations in charts with the precision of someone who understands that a single decimal point can mean the difference between a child going home and a child not going home. Her hands have started showing their age, slight tremor in the left when she's tired, calluses from 2 decades of starting lines in difficult veins, veins that other nurses call impossible until Margaret threads the needle through them anyway. At 11:13 p.m., Dr. Marcus Sterling enters the ICU like he owns it. Navy suit, Italian shoes that click against the linoleum with the rhythm of a metronome, followed by 3 residents who laugh at something he hasn't said yet because that's what residents do when they want the attending's recommendation letter. He's 42, board-certified in pediatric critical care, has published papers on sepsis protocols, and carries himself with the particular confidence of a man who has never been told no by anyone with institutional power. His eyes scan the ICU from the entrance, cataloguing the patients, the monitors, the staff. He pauses at Margaret's station, where she's updating a chart with a kind of meticulous documentation that would satisfy any auditor or any lawsuit. He looks at her name badge. Margaret Walsh, RN. No credentials after the letters. No MSN. No PCCN. Just RN, the baseline, the entry point, the kind of credential a man like Sterling sees as equivalent to a diploma from a vocational school. She's 61 years old, her grey-streaked hair pulled so tight it might be cutting off circulation, no wedding ring, no distinguishing features beyond a certain weariness that Sterling reads as the exhaustion of someone who never advanced beyond where she started. Margaret feels his gaze the way you feel someone standing too close in an elevator. She meets his eyes for exactly 2 seconds, not hostile, not submissive, just a professional acknowledgement, then returns to her charting. The slight limp in her right leg, the consequence of a bullet that passed through the femur 3 years before Sterling was born, goes unnoticed. Most things about Margaret go unnoticed. This has been deliberate. Sterling moves past her station without acknowledgement. One of the residents asks him a question about the Jackson protocol for pediatric vasopressor dosing, and Sterling answers while walking, his voice carrying the comfortable authority of someone accustomed to being listened to. Margaret continues charting. The fluorescent lights continue humming. A ventilator wheezed its mechanical rhythm from Bay 4, where an 8-year-old with acute respiratory distress syndrome fights the machine that's keeping him alive. The intercom crackles at 11:37 p.m. The dispatcher's voice comes through with the kind of careful professionalism that means something serious is incoming. Trauma alert. Level 1 activation. Incoming transfer from Ellington Field Medical. Pediatric patient, male, age 12, spinal cord trauma, mechanism Baghdad IED incident, ETA 40 minutes. Incoming to ICU post-stabilization. Stand by for handoff report. The ICU doesn't move much at the sound of a trauma alert. These are pediatric nurses, they've heard trauma alerts before. But something in the phrasing lands differently. Baghdad. IED. 12 years old. A child. The idea that a 12-year-old was in Baghdad, that a 12-year-old was close enough to an IED to take trauma, that a 12-year-old's spinal cord was damaged by an explosion, this registers in the way that loss registers. The residents exchange glances. Sterling straightens. His jaw shifts slightly, the way a predator shifts when it catches the scent of something valuable. Margaret doesn't move. She's already finished her charting. She's already begun the mental preparation that comes from knowing an admission is coming, the kind of preparation that requires clearing the emotional space and filling it with protocols and procedures, and the kind of focus that keeps children alive when everything else fails. But there's something else in her stillness, something that doesn't register as fear or excitement or the normal anticipation that comes with admitting a trauma case. There's a tightness in her chest that feels like recognition. Sterling walks directly to the charge nurse station. His voice carries across the ICU, the kind of voice that's trained to project authority. I'm taking the incoming. Baghdad IED, spinal cord injury, pediatric. High-profile case. This will be my admission and my patient. I want my residents on the line, my chart, my protocols. He pauses. His eyes drift across the ICU floor, settling for a moment on Margaret, who hasn't looked up from her work. And I'll need an experienced bedside nurse. Not anyone still learning. This is going to be scrutinized. The charge nurse, an older woman named Patricia who's worked with Margaret for 11 years, doesn't respond immediately. She looks at Margaret, looks back at Sterling, then nods. I'll assign Walsh. She's our most experienced night shift nurse. 12 years on pediatric ICU. 20, Margaret says quietly, still writing. It's not a correction offered for vanity. It's a statement of fact, the way you'd state a measurement. Sterling's head turns. He looks at Margaret like he's seeing her for the first time, which he is really seeing her, not just cataloguing her age and credentials. There's something in his expression that hardens into decision. Find someone else. I need someone current with advanced certifications. Not someone riding out the end of a career. Patricia's shoulders tense. Margaret simply sets down her pen and closes her chart. She stands, and there it is, the slight limp, the way her right leg doesn't quite move with full confidence, the residual cost of something that Sterling's medical training has never prepared him to recognize. She looks at Sterling directly for the first time. Her voice is steady, neutral, professional, understood, doctor. She walks back to the ICU floor, back to the other patients, back to the work that needs doing. But Patricia is staring at Sterling like she's trying to decide whether to say something. She doesn't. She just watches as he begins preparing for the admission of Admiral Harrison's son, the trauma case that's about to arrive at Oak Creek Memorial within the next 37 minutes, the case that Sterling has already begun calculating could secure him a position on the hospital board by next fiscal year. Margaret continues her rounds. A child in Bay 2 needs her for adjusted. Another in Bay 5 has a fever that needs documenting and reporting. The work continues, the endless small work of keeping children alive, the work that no one celebrates and everyone takes for granted. She moves through it with the economy of motion that comes from having done this exact thing thousands of times, 10,000 times, enough times that her hands know where to go before her mind gives them permission. The clock reads 11:58 p.m. Somewhere between the hospital and Ellington Field, a convoy is moving through Houston traffic. Inside that convoy, a 12-year-old boy named Tyler Harrison lies on a stretcher, his legs unresponsive, his father, an admiral with 3 decades of military service, sitting beside him and wondering how his son's training visit to the base had turned into this. Sterling stands at the central station, reviewing the incoming case file on his tablet, already composing the narrative that will make this case his own. He doesn't know yet that the most experienced trauma nurse in his ICU has already decided she's taking this case anyway, because that's what Senior Chief Petty Officer Margaret Walsh does when children are in danger. She appears. But that's not what Patricia sees when she watches Margaret move through the ICU with the terrible grace of someone who has held dying children in her arms and somehow kept going anyway. Patricia sees a woman whose hands are steady in a way that can't be taught, whose eyes carry a weight that goes beyond 20 years of nursing, whose entire presence suggests that whatever is about to come through those doors in the next 35 minutes, Margaret Walsh has already survived worse. The fluorescent lights hum. A monitor beeps. Somewhere in the distance, the sound of a helicopter begins. The monitor beeps. Somewhere in the distance, the sound of a helicopter begins. Dr. Sterling stands in the nurse's station at 2:44 a.m., his white coat still pristine, his voice cutting through the fluorescent hum like a scalpel. 8 residents circle him, young men in starched collars, eager as wolves. Margaret preps Tyler Harrison's room 3 corridors away, unaware that she's already been discussed, dismissed, and marked for removal. "Gentlemen," Sterling says, his voice smooth as oil, "we have a VIP case. The Admiral's boy. Paralyzed from an IED strike in Baghdad. This elevates everyone involved. The hospital board will be watching. I need precision. Excellence. Not." He pauses, gestures vaguely toward the direction of the pediatric ward, seniority without credentials. The residents laugh. One of them, a resident named Prescott, leans against the desk. "How old is the night shift nurse on this case, sir?" Sterling smiles. It's the smile of a man who has already won. 61. 20 years of experience, which is to say, 20 years of falling behind medical advancement. He pulls a $50 bill from his pocket, places it on the desk with the deliberation of a prosecutor presenting evidence. "I'll wager this, Grandma here quits before the week's out. High-profile cases require high-profile nurses. She'll feel the pressure and fold." The residents exchange glances. One reaches for his wallet. Another laughs, that particular brand of laughter that only exists between people who have never been questioned in their lives. Margaret stands in Tyler's room, smoothing the corners of the fitted sheet with hands that have performed this gesture 10,000 times. She doesn't hear the laughter. She won't hear about the bet until Thursday, when a resident with decent instincts mentions it in passing. By then, the damage will already be architectural. Sterling moves through the hospital like weather, unavoidable, changing the pressure in every room he enters. On Wednesday morning, during rounds, he stands at Tyler's bedside with his residents arrayed behind him like a phalanx. Margaret adjusts the boys for, her movements efficient, her voice soft when she speaks to Tyler. "How's the pain today, buddy?" 1 to 10. 4. Tyler whispers. His father, Admiral Richard Harrison, 63, shoulders like a linebacker, jawline that could cut glass, stands at the window. He hasn't slept since the IED detonated. Margaret can smell it on him, the acrid combination of fear sweat and hotel soap. Sterling swoops in. "Tyler, I'm Dr. Sterling. I'm personally overseeing your case. Excellence only." He doesn't acknowledge Margaret. Instead, he turns to the Admiral. "We have our best people on this, sir. I'll be personally supervising, even the nursing staff. Some of our night shift personnel lack the credentials for high acuity cases." Margaret's hand pauses on the fall line. 1 breath. 2. She finishes her task and steps back, her face a map with no landmarks. The Admiral glances at her, a brief, measuring look, then back to Sterling. "I want the best care for my son." "Of course, sir. You'll have it." By Thursday, Sterling has begun the strategic phase. He reassigns Margaret to documentation duties instead of direct care. He questions her vital sign assessments in front of the team. Are you sure that blood pressure is accurate? We should verify it ourselves. He restricts her access to Tyler's medication administration, insisting a resident observe each injection. It's competent sabotage, nothing overt enough to report, everything calculated to make her feel the weight of invisibility. It's 1:19 a.m. in the cafeteria when Sterling decides to escalate. The cafeteria at Oak Creek Memorial is a fluorescent purgatory, 3 vending machines, a coffee station that smells like burned beans, 4 tables arranged with the intimacy of a morgue. Margaret carries her tray, black coffee, an apple, a sandwich she won't eat. She's been a nurse for 43 years across 2 continents, and she's learned that eating when the world is unstable is a waste of calories. Sterling sits at a table with 2 other physicians, their voices low but not low enough. Margaret passes. His foot extends, not a trip, but close enough. It's the physical equivalent of a whisper campaign. Her tray hits the floor. The coffee spreads in a dark pool that looks like blood under the fluorescent lights. The sandwich tumbles. The apple rolls toward the trash. Margaret kneels, the right knee resists, old shrapnel pain remembering a night in Kandahar when an RPG came through a tent wall, and begins gathering the debris. Sterling stands. He's 6'2" in his shoes, and he uses the height like a weapon. Careful, sweetheart. Coordination goes with age. Maybe it's time for retirement. His voice carries across the cafeteria. Every eye locks onto them. He drops patient charts at her feet. They flutter and scatter into the coffee, papers blooming with dark stains. Pick that up, sweetheart. Margaret kneels slowly. Her movements are deliberate, each one a choice. She gathers the papers, the tray, the fragments of the apple. The cafeteria is silent except for the refrigerator's hum and the distant ring of a telephone that nobody answers. One tear escapes, just one, the only gesture her body allows, and tracks down her cheek. She wipes it without breaking eye contact as she rises, papers dripping, composure like armor. Her voice comes steady as stone. I've picked up heavier things than your ego, doctor. Sterling's jaw tightens. The silence lasts exactly 3 seconds. Then a resident coughs, a nervous sound, a crack in the hierarchy. Sterling turns away, but not before his shoulders go rigid with something that isn't quite rage. It's worse. It's the rage of a man whose dominance has been questioned in front of an audience. Clean up that mess, he says to no one in particular, and walks out. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part is what Sterling does next. He spends Friday making phone calls. The hospital board member who owes him a favor, a political debt from a malpractice settlement Sterling helped navigate. The nursing director who approved his budget requests. The administrator who sits on 3 committees with Sterling's brother-in-law. His power source is institutional, carefully cultivated over 7 years at Oak Creek Memorial. He's not just a doctor. He's a doctor with leverage. By Saturday evening, Margaret is reassigned again. This time, it's different. She's assigned to monitoring charts, paperwork only. No patient contact. No direct care. No opportunity to demonstrate competence. Sterling has calculated that invisibility will do what insults could not, break her. She accepts the assignment without protest. Saturday morning, she arrives at 10:27 p.m. for her 11 p.m. shift, clocks in, and moves through the pediatric ward with the deliberation of someone following a ritual they've performed 10,000 times. Tyler is sleeping. The monitors breathe their electronic rhythm. The hospital smells like antiseptic and fluorescent light and the particular exhaustion of 2 a.m. She sits at the nurse's station, reassigned, sidelined, erased, and begins reviewing charts. At 3:14 a.m., the monitors above Tyler's bed begin to scream. The sound is specific, that particular alarm that indicates a dropping heart rate, a losing battle. Margaret's head snaps up. She doesn't move. Not yet. Dr. Sterling is the primary. Dr. Sterling will respond. but Sterling is in the physician's lounge. The residents are scattered across the hospital. And Tyler Harrison, 12 years old, son of an admiral, kid who didn't ask for an IED in a Baghdad street, is going into cardiac arrest on a Saturday night when the attending is unreachable and the world has narrowed to one bed and one failing heart. Margaret moves. The monitors began their high-pitched shriek at 11:44 p.m. on a Saturday. Tyler's oxygen saturation dropped first, 94, 91, 88, then his heart rate climbed like it was trying to escape his chest. Margaret heard it from across the unit before she saw it. That sound. The particular timbre of a child's distress alarm was something no nurse ever forgot, a frequency that bypassed the conscious mind and triggered pure animal response. She moved toward the bay before the code nurse even called it out. Dr. Sterling was already there, coffee still steaming in his hand from the break room. He stared at the monitors with the kind of stillness that meant he wasn't seeing them at all. Margaret had seen that look before, in Baghdad, when fresh surgeons arrived at the trauma center and realized the textbook answers didn't account for the velocity of real bleeding. "Get me a full set of vitals," Sterling said. His voice was steady enough, but it was the steadiness of someone reading from a script he'd written the night before. Not the steadiness of someone who'd drowned a patient before. The resident, a kid named Joe who'd been shadowing Sterling all week, was already moving, fingers flying across the monitor. BP 78/52. Dropping. Heart rate 146. O2 sat continuing to fall, now 85. Margaret saw it immediately. The pattern. The geometry of crisis written in one small boy's failing physiology. Tyler's neck veins distended like cords, visible even in the ICU's flat fluorescent light. His chest heaved against the ventilator, fighting the machine's rhythm. His skin had taken on that peculiar waxy pallor that meant his body was shutting down the periphery, pulling blood inward to protect the vital organs. Beck's triad. Muffled heart sounds. Distended neck veins. Hypertension. The words formed in her mind with the clarity of a firing squad's command. Cardiac tamponade. The pericardial sac, the thin membrane surrounding the heart like a plastic bag, was filling with fluid. Every beat, Tyler's heart was compressing itself, strangling itself, drowning in its own space. "Get cardiology on the phone," Sterling said, still holding the coffee. "And set up for a possible surgical consult. We need the OR on standby." Margaret's hands were already moving. She'd pulled the crash cart closer, her fingers finding the pericardiocentesis kit before her brain had fully authorized the movement. Muscle memory. 20 years of night shifts. 3 tours in a place where the difference between dead and alive was often the difference between hesitation and action. "Dr. Sterling," she said. Her voice carried that particular quality of calm that came from having already made a decision her superiors hadn't caught up to yet. "We don't have time for consultation." He turned to her as if she'd spoken in Mandarin. His face underwent a fascinating transformation, confusion, then irritation, then the dawning awareness that she was suggesting something outside the established hierarchy. "The cardiologist needs to evaluate. The patient's in cardiogenic shock," Margaret said. Not a request. Not a suggestion. A statement of medical fact delivered in the voice of someone who'd held more dying children than Sterling had hours of sleep. "We have maybe 4 minutes before full cardiovascular collapse. The needle goes now or we're calling a code." Sterling's mouth opened. Closed. He looked at the monitors. At Tyler. At his coffee cup as if it might contain answers about how a 61-year-old night nurse had just ordered him to step aside. The silence lasted exactly 2 seconds. Then Margaret was moving, already prepping the sight on Tyler's chest, fingers finding the 4th intercostal space, midclavicular line, the precise geography of intervention. An alcohol swab. The sharp sting of cold against skin. The needle in her hand, a 14-gauge angiocath, long and bright and certain, felt like coming home after 20 years of pretending she'd ever left. "Margaret, you can't," Sterling started. She didn't look up. The needle passed through the chest wall with barely any resistance, that particular tactile feedback that meant tissue giving way to intention. Residence. Her eyes flicked to Cho and the two others hovering at the periphery of the crisis. Watch this. You'll need it. Not because they would, but because someone had to learn. Someone had to carry the knowledge forward after she was gone. The needle entered the pericardial sac and the syringe filled with fluid, dark, hemorrhagic, the color of old blood, and as she drew back, drawing back, the monitors began their slow descent from the screaming crisis pitch. O2 sac climbed. 86, 89. 92. Heart rate began to drop. 146, 138. 127. Blood pressure rose like water finding its level again. 82/56. 88/62. 95/68. The fluid kept coming. 30 milliliters. 50. 75. She could feel Sterling's presence behind her, the particular quality of a man watching his world reorganize itself without his permission. Cho's breathing had shifted. The nurses, Rodriguez, Chen, the travel nurse whose name Margaret never quite caught, had all stopped moving. The room had taken on that specific texture of awe mixed with the fundamental recognition that they'd just watched someone step outside the boundaries of what they were supposed to be. Tyler's sinus rhythm stabilized. Regular. Normal. The rhythm of a 12-year-old boy whose heart, freed from its own asphyxiation, could return to the simple work of keeping him alive. Margaret withdrew the needle with the same precision she'd inserted it. The fluid continued to drip from the angiocath into the collection chamber, 55 milliliters total, and she secured it with tape that she laid down with the methodical care of someone who'd learned that the details separated survival from the alternative. Sats 96%, Cho whispered. BP stable at 98/68. Normal sinus rhythm. Margaret disposed of the needle. Gloved hands. Crisp. Professional. The hands of someone who'd done this before, though not in this hospital, not in Houston, not in the last 20 years that had supposedly been spent pushing meds and checking monitors and staying invisible. Sterling was still holding his coffee. It had gone cold enough that steam no longer rose from the rim. Continue monitoring, Margaret said to the room. She was still using that voice, the command voice, the one that bypassed the normal social architecture of hospitals and rank and who was supposed to be in charge. Start and 4 fluid challenge if BP drops below 90 again. I want a portable chest X-ray within the hour and full cardiac workup at first light. Notify the surgical team that the patient is stable but we may need drainage if fluid reaccumulates. No one asked her if she had the authority to give those orders. The tone had been enough. The certainty had been enough. The fact that she'd just saved a child's life with her hands had rearranged everyone's understanding of what authority actually looked like. She walked to the sink and began washing her hands. The soap smelled like hospital, that particular combination of antimicrobial compounds and the ghost of 1,000 other people's skin, and the water ran clear and hot and ordinary. She could feel Sterling behind her still, his presence like a physical thing, like standing too close to something radioactive and waiting for the effects to manifest. I'm going on break, Margaret said quietly. Not a request. Not even really information. Just a statement of what was about to happen, delivered in the tone of someone who understood that certain decisions had already been made at levels above everyone's pay grade. She left the ICU before anyone could respond. The hallway outside was empty, 3 a.m. on a Saturday night, when the hospital contracted to its essential functions and the rest of the world was sleeping or drinking or pretending they hadn't made catastrophic decisions they couldn't take back. Margaret found the break room and sat in the vinyl chair that smelled like someone else's lunch and the particular staleness of a room that never quite got enough air. She didn't turn on the lights. She sat in the dark and listened to the hospital's nighttime sounds, the distant hum of the fax system, the squeak of a gurney rolling past in the hallway, the soft metallic click of the vending machine resetting itself, and waited for what came next. It took exactly 47 minutes for Sterling to make his first call. She knew this because her phone buzzed at 3:51 a.m. with an email notification. then another, then a third, each one bearing the unmistakable formality of institutional communication. Incident report. Urgent review. Access restriction pending investigation. The machine was turning. The fortress was being built. And Margaret Walsh, who'd spent 20 years invisible, had just made herself impossible to ignore. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that she'd already known this was coming. The moment she'd picked up the needle. The moment she'd ordered Sterling to step aside. The moment she'd saved a boy whose father had once held her when she couldn't stop shaking. That was the moment she'd made the choice to stop hiding. She sat in the dark break room and waited for dawn. The break room was silent except for the refrigerator's hum and the fluorescent lights buzzing overhead like insects trapped in glass. Margaret sat with her hands folded, watching the darkness through the window gradually shift to grey. Dawn came slow to Houston, and she didn't move to meet it. By 6:16 a.m., the email arrived on her personal phone. Subject line, Employment Status Review, Urgent. She didn't need to open it. She already knew. The investigation had moved faster than institutional machinery usually allowed. That meant Sterling had leverage. That meant someone had listened when he made his calls. She imagined him doing it between patient rounds, phone pressed to his ear in the doctor's lounge, voice smooth as oil. "Patricia, it's Dr. Sterling from Oak Creek. About that nurse on my service." Board member Patricia Chen would take the call. They always did when Sterling called. His family had donated the new cardiac wings renovations. His connections ran through the hospital's infrastructure like copper wire, and everyone who touched the institution felt the current. She performed a procedure she wasn't qualified for, Sterling would have said. Voice steady. Concerned. Reasonable. Emergency pericardiocentesis. Outside her scope. High-profile case, high liability. I need to protect the hospital's credibility. Patricia Chen would have made notes. Asked questions. The doubt would have taken root before Margaret even knew it was being planted. By 7:15 a.m., Sterling had called her references. Both of them. Dr. Marcus Webb, who'd supervised her for 3 years at Memorial Hermann. Nurse Director Susan Okafor, who'd worked adjacent to Margaret's unit at St. Luke's before relocating to Austin. Sterling's technique was precision work, not accusations, but careful misrepresentation wrapped in institutional language. I'm just verifying some clinical incidents, Sterling would have said. Ms. Walsh performed an advanced procedure without authorization during a pediatric trauma. We're concerned about her judgment. Did you ever observe similar, independent action in her practice? Webb would have been careful. Margaret was always cautious. Followed protocol. But Sterling would have twisted it. So when she deviated from protocol, it was unusual. Concerning. The seed planted. The doubt growing. By 8:11 a.m., hospital investigators pulled 5 years of Margaret's charts. Every shift. Every patient note. Every signature. They weren't looking for excellence. They were looking for violations. For documentation gaps. For anything that could support a predetermined conclusion. Margaret knew how this worked. She'd watched it happen to others. Sterling had written his formal complaint by 8:55 a.m. She found out later what it said, a masterpiece of institutional sabotage. The pericardiocentesis was framed not as an emergency life-saving procedure but as a reckless intervention that endangered a patient. She inserted a needle into the boy's chest cavity without physician oversight, the complaint would read. The fact that it resolved the tamponade does not excuse protocol violation. An RN without advanced critical care certification had no authority to attempt such a procedure, regardless of circumstances. The logic was perfect. The conclusion inevitable. By 11:06 a.m., a special session of the hospital's credentialing committee convened. 15 minutes. That's all it took. Sterling didn't even attend. He didn't need to. His network held the votes before the meeting started. The termination letter arrived at 12:34 p.m. Margaret didn't open it until nearly midnight. By then, security had already called. "We need you to collect your personal items and vacate the pediatric unit," the guard had said. Not a request. Not an apology. Just logistics. She'd worked the night shift for 20 years. Every evening, she'd clocked in at 10:38 p.m., walked past the security desk with a nod, badged into the pediatric ICU, and stepped into a world where she was no one. Just a nurse. Just an old woman who knew how to hold a child's hand while they coded. Just a pair of steady hands and a voice that didn't break. At 11:53 p.m. on a Sunday, those hands no longer belonged to Oak Creek Memorial. Security walked her through the hallway she'd memorized down to the floorboard cracks. The unit was dim to night lighting, monitor glow casting blue shadows across patient rooms, exit signs glowing red above doors, fluorescent strips humming their endless mechanical song. The sterile smell of the ICU hung in the air, that mixture of antiseptic and something underneath it, something human and broken and fighting. Her badge didn't work anymore. The security guard, a man she'd seen 500 times and never spoken to, swiped it at the locker room entrance. The light blinked red. Dead. He cleared his throat. Uncomfortable. "You need help with the box, Ms. Walsh." "No." Her locker was on the third row, fourth from the left. She'd occupied the same space for 20 years. Some nurses decorated theirs with family photos, children's drawings, vacation pictures. Margaret's held one item, a cracked ceramic mug that said Navy in faded letters. She'd bought it at a PX in Pensacola 34 years ago, before Baghdad, before the PTSD hit like shrapnel, before she'd learned that healing means disappearing. She placed the mug in the cardboard box. The succulent plant came next, a small desert rose that had been dying for 2 months despite her careful watering. The leaves had turned brown at the edges, the stems gone soft. She'd kept it alive through sheer stubbornness, the same way she'd kept herself alive. It wasn't working. She placed it in the box anyway. Behind the scrubs she'd laid out for the next shift, shifts that would never come, she found the boots. Combat boots, desert tan, the leather creased from wear and still carrying the ghost of red sand from a city 12,000 miles away. She'd carried them in this locker since day one. Never worn them to Oak Creek. Never let anyone ask where they came from. She held them for 7 seconds, just feeling the weight of them. The soles had worn thin on the left heel, a favor of carrying uneven loads, of running through rubble with a bleeding child pressed against her body. She placed them gently in the box. Last was the photograph. 8 inches by 10 inches, printed from a digital file she'd kept encrypted on an old laptop. It showed 12 people in desert camouflage, dust covering their uniforms, the sun glaring white-hot behind them. They were standing in front of a Humvee with the number 3 painted on the side. Phantom Squadron, Naval Special Warfare Unit 3. Date stamp, March 12, 2007. Baghdad. She counted the faces. 12 faces that had been young enough to believe they were invincible. 6 of those faces were gone. Dead. Not in slow hospital beds surrounded by family, dead in the way soldiers die. Explosions. IED strikes. Snipers. Sudden and final and leaving nothing behind but the counting. 3 more had limbs missing. She knew where they lived now. One in San Diego, teaching remedial mathematics at a charter school. One in Portland, working construction on a prosthetics clinic, building the place that had given him 2 new legs. One still at Walter Reed, last she'd heard, learning to walk again in a way his body had forgotten. The other 6 had left the service and become invisible, the way she'd become invisible. She slipped the photograph face up into the box and felt something shift inside her chest, not pain exactly, but the echo of pain, the scar tissue where it had been. The security guard cleared his throat again. "I'm sorry about this." She didn't respond. She walked past him toward the exit, the cardboard box growing heavier with every step, as if grief had weight and density and the ability to accumulate. The bus stop bench was 3 blocks away. She sat in the rain, box balanced on her lap, water dripping from her hair and soaking into her scrubs. A couple hurried past under an umbrella, not looking at her. A car splashed through a puddle, spraying her legs with dirty water that smelled like diesel and sewage. She stared at the photograph visible through the open top of the box, 12 young faces, 6 gone, 3 broken, for trying to be ordinary in a world that had stopped feeling safe. The rain fell harder. Her breath came in measured counts, military habit, old training. 1, 2, 3, 4. Breathe in. Exhale. Stay calm. Stay composed. She'd been 18 years old the first time she'd held a bleeding casualty. It was a training exercise, sand-filled dummy, but they'd made it as real as the instructors could manage. Her hands had been steady even then. They'd been steady through Kandahar. Steady through Helmand Province. Steady through the embassy compound ambush on March 12, 2007, when a Humvee had taken an IED strike meant for the command vehicle and she'd crawled into smoke thick enough to block the sun. Steady when she'd found a child in the rubble, 8 years old, bleeding from shrapnel wounds in his legs and abdomen. She could still feel the weight of him. Still feel his small hand gripping her combat vest like it was the only solid thing in a world that was falling apart. "I've got you," she'd whispered. "Stay with me. That's an order, understand? Stay with me." The boy's eyes had fixed on her face, the only thing he could focus on while everything else spun and broke and burned. She'd run with him through smoke toward the extraction point, toward the medics, toward his father screaming his name from behind a perimeter someone else was holding. She'd handed the boy to the first medic she saw and turned back into the smoke without waiting to see if he lived, without letting herself hope, without adding another face to her count. 6 months later, the PTSD had hit like a second IED. The nightmares. The hypervigilance. The way her hands would shake on good days and feel numb on bad ones. She'd walked into a recruitment officer's office at Naval Personnel Command and asked to separate. No fighting. No medical review board. She'd had the clearance for a medical discharge that would have given her full benefits for life. Instead, she'd asked for a quiet exit. Anonymous. No ceremony. No recognition. Just gone. The Navy had fought her on it. Senior chief petty officers didn't walk away. Their record showed 18 commendations, 2 Silver Stars, a Navy Cross, 2 Purple Hearts. They didn't voluntarily separate into nothing. She'd signed the paperwork anyway. Then she'd found an anonymous city, a night shift nursing position that required little beyond an RN license, a studio apartment no one visited, and a 2-decade practice in being invisible. She'd heal the way invisible people heal, slowly, quietly, in the dark spaces no one asks about. And now even that was gone. The 2:17 a.m. bus never came. It was 12:16 when she gave up, stood from the soak bench, and started walking. The box grew heavier. Her legs moved with the weight of it, muscle memory from carrying casualties, from carrying weight that wasn't supposed to break you but did anyway. For miles. Houston in the rain. The streets nearly empty. A convenience store clerk locking up at 1:44 a.m., not meeting her eyes. A homeless man sleeping under a bridge, cardboard box like hers but with a sleeping person inside it. Red light stretching toward green. The hum of the city settling into its smallest hours. By the time she reached her apartment at 2:07 a.m., she was soaked through. She set the box on her kitchen table. She didn't open it. She just sat across from it and waited for something to happen, for the police to arrive, for the hospital to change their minds, for time to move in a direction that made sense. At 2:34 a.m., her phone buzzed. A voicemail. From a number she didn't recognize. She played it. A man's voice, older, command in the cadence even when breaking. "This is Admiral Michael Harrison. I'm calling about my son. I'm told you were his nurse tonight. I need to speak with you immediately. Please call me back." Buzz. Another message. Same voice, tighter now. "I've been told you may have been terminated. I'm at the hospital now. I'm having that decision reviewed. Buzz. Another. I don't know how to say this over voicemail, but there's something about you that I recognize. Something that matters. Please. Call me. Buzz. Another. His voice cracking slightly. I know this is irregular. But I need to talk to you about Baghdad. About an extraction. About an officer named Phantom who I've been looking for 15 years. Buzz. Another, quieter, my son asked for you. When he woke up, he said your name. Not your name, a call sign. He said Phantom. He remembers. God help me, he remembers. She sat in her kitchen holding the phone, rain still dripping from her hair, the cardboard box on the table containing everything she'd thought she'd left behind. The boots. The mug. The photograph. The dead faces. The dead faces were looking up from the box, frozen in time at an age when they believed they were invincible. One of them had lived. One of the children she'd carried from the smoke had survived. Had grown up. Had become an admiral's son. Had become a boy in a hospital bed who could whisper a call sign she'd used 24 hours at a time in the Baghdad heat. Her hands, for the first time in 40 years of service and 20 years of hiding, began to tremble. Dr. Sterling retreated to his office at 3:24 a.m., the fluorescent lights casting everything in the color of old bone. His hands moved across the keyboard with the precision of someone who'd spent 30 years building a career on perception rather than competence. The email he composed to the hospital board read like an act of contrition, but every word was calculated. While Margaret Walsh's military service is commendable, he typed, it does not negate the fundamental protocol violations evident in her unauthorized medical intervention. We must maintain institutional standards regardless of personal heroism. I recommend we allow her to resign quietly with severance rather than pursue formal termination. It was brilliant misdirection, make it sound like he was being magnanimous, protecting her dignity, when in reality he was trying to bury the case before the Admiral's connections could complicate things. He hit send, then immediately pulled up Patricia Chen's contact information. The call went to voicemail. He called Rodriguez in HR, his voice calm as still water. We need to proceed with the termination. She still practiced outside her scope. Document everything. Rodriguez's response came back ice cold. Dr. Sterling, the Admiral has requested a full review of Margaret's case, including the circumstances of her suspension. The line went dead. Sterling sat in the darkness of his office for exactly 90 seconds. Then he moved. He accessed the hospital's personnel management system using his administrative credentials he'd secured years ago by donating to the IT department's annual gala. His fingers felt like they belonged to someone else as he opened Margaret Walsh's file. The digital folder was thin compared to what he needed it to be. He began to alter dates, systematically working backward through her employment history. He fabricated a performance review from 2019, backdating it to create the appearance of prior concerns about her clinical judgment. He wrote complaint summaries that never existed, vague references to questionable decision-making, failure to follow chain of command, unauthorized independent actions during code situations. Each entry was crafted carefully, never specific enough to be verified but damaging enough to establish a pattern. He created an entire mythology of incompetence around a woman who'd just saved a child's life with hands that had performed miracles in fields of blood he couldn't comprehend. Sterling was meticulous. He altered timestamps, modified file metadata, covered his digital footprints with the care of someone who'd once considered himself untouchable. What he didn't know, what no one in that hospital knew, was that Oak Creek Memorial's recent Medicare fraud investigation had triggered FBI monitoring of all administrative record access. The hospital's compliance officer, at the behest of federal investigators, had installed keystroke monitoring on accounts with elevated privileges. Every keystroke Sterling made. Every document he touched. Every timestamp he altered. It all flagged in real time. By Thursday morning, 2 FBI agents sat across from Oak Creek Memorial's CEO in a conference room on the 3rd floor. They displayed a series of flagged access logs, showing Sterling's alterations to Margaret's personnel file, the timestamps revealing modifications dated years before they were actually created. The CEO's face drained of color as they walked through the federal charges: falsification of medical records, obstruction of justice, tampering with evidence. The agency had been investigating hospital nepotism for 8 months, and Sterling had just handed them the linchpin they needed to expand their case into the entire administrative structure. By Thursday afternoon, federal investigators had built a case that would have taken him a year to untangle legally. Friday morning arrived with the kind of clarity that precedes catastrophe. At 2:37 p.m., 2 FBI agents in dark suits entered the pediatric ICU at Oak Creek Memorial. Sterling was at the nurse's station, writing medication orders, still operating under the assumption that his alterations were invisible, that his network would protect him, that the world still bent to his will. One of the agents approached from his left, the other from his right. The movement was choreographed and absolute. Dr. Marcus Sterling. Sterling looked up, confused, as if someone had called out a name that didn't belong to him. "You're under arrest for falsification of federal healthcare documents and obstruction of justice." The handcuffs appeared, silver, heavy, the sound they made when they locked around his wrists like a door slamming on another man's life. The pediatric ICU went silent. Not the quiet of night shift exhaustion, but the silence of collective breath being held. Every nurse within sight stopped moving. Every monitor seemed to pause its beeping. Sterling tried to speak, but the agent cut him off with the words that would end everything: "You have the right to remain silent." The perp walk began. His Italian shoes, the ones he'd bought on the $50 bet he'd made about Margaret Walsh, clicked against the tile floor. Click! 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 Past the break room where he'd knocked her cafeteria tray to the ground. Past the nurse's station where he'd made his public wager about her resignation. Past Tyler Harrison's room, where Margaret stood in the doorway in her scrubs, one hand resting steady on the boy's shoulder, her face neutral as stone, her eyes the color of someone who'd already survived the worst that could be done to her. Sterling tried to turn his head, tried to maintain some fragment of dignity, but there was nothing left to maintain. The FBI agent's grip on his elbow was like a vice made of institutional consequence. The elevator doors opened, and as Sterling was led inside, someone began to clap. It started with a single person, maybe one of the night nurses, maybe someone who'd been carrying the weight of his contempt for years. Then another pair of hands joined in. Then another. By the time the elevator doors closed on his face, the entire ICU had erupted into applause that sounded less like celebration and more like the sound of a building being set free. In the hallway outside Tyler's room, Margaret did not move. She did not allow the tremor in her chest to reach her face. She simply stood there, one hand on a 12-year-old boy's shoulder, and watched the lights above the elevator display Sterling's descent, floor 7, floor 6, floor 5, until he disappeared completely. What happened in the following hours moved with the velocity of institutional machinery finally working correctly. Federal investigators compiled Sterling's fabricated documents and compared them with Margaret's actual service record. They pulled her sealed Navy file. What emerged was a profile so decorated, so classified, so fundamentally at odds with Sterling's narrative that the hospital administration's silence became deafening. Senior Chief Petty Officer Margaret Walsh. 24 years of active duty. Navy Cross. 2 Silver Stars. 14 lives saved under fire, including, the federal agents confirmed this detail with particular emphasis, Admiral James Harrison's son during a combat extraction in Baghdad in 2009. Her sealed records arrived at Oak Creek Memorial on Friday at 6:15 p.m. The hospital's legal team read through them in silence. By Saturday morning, the hospital CEO was calling Margaret's home phone, leaving voicemails that trembled with apology and restitution. By Sunday, a formal written offer had been delivered, full reinstatement, complete back pay for every shift she'd missed, and a newly created position as Director of Emergency Nursing with a mandate to reshape the hospital's trauma protocols and culture. Margaret Walsh sat in her kitchen on that Sunday morning, holding the letter in hands that had forgotten how to shake. She read it twice, 3 times, the words blurring as she did. Not because she was crying, the capacity for tears had been trained out of her decades ago, but because the letter represented something she'd stopped believing possible, the world catching up to who she actually was. She'd spent 20 years hiding in plain sight, and now, suddenly, there was nowhere left to hide. Her true name was in the system. Her medals were no longer sealed. Her past was no longer past. What the hospital didn't understand, what the FBI agents couldn't quite articulate in their reports, was that Margaret had never wanted recognition. She'd wanted only to work the night shift in the pediatric ICU, to hold dying children and comfort their parents, to use her hands for healing instead of survival. But the world had demanded its reckoning. Sterling had forced a confrontation she'd spent 2 decades avoiding. And now, standing at the threshold of this new role, this public identity, this impossible recognition, she understood something the cafeteria tray incident should have taught her: true class isn't about remaining invisible. True class is what you do when the lights go out, and Margaret Walsh had spent her entire life doing the right thing in the dark. On her kitchen table lay 2 objects: the worn combat boots she'd carried home from Baghdad, and a photograph of her Navy platoon taken in 2008. 14 faces. 7 of them were now gone. She didn't touch either object. She simply looked at them, and then she made a decision that would reshape emergency nursing at Oak Creek Memorial for the next 15 years. If you've made it this far, you know that the people who save your life aren't always the ones with the titles on their doors. Subscribe to this channel, like this video, and tell us in the comments, have you ever been underestimated by someone who had no idea what you'd actually survived? Because the quietest person in the room might just be the one holding everything together.